Welcome to this presentation from the Fortis Knowledge Base. In this presentation, we're going to look at the relationship between PAYE and joint and several liability when all the money is sent to the umbrella company, as it typically is currently. We're also going to look specifically at the situation where you rely on payslip checks and monthly RTI verifications. We'll look at the impact this has on the potential joint and several liabilities. It's important to highlight that in these examples we have assumed that the PAYE liability has been calculated correctly. You should be aware that if there are wrong payroll calculations or wrongly paid tax-free expenses or the application of wrong tax codings, these could all result in additional liabilities. But these could be managed and controlled when using the Fortis system. It's also important to recognise that under joint and several liability, the significant liability sits with the payment of the main PAYE amount due, and in many cases small errors in payroll calculations are insignificant and can easily be handled through normal business expenditure and do not pose any threat of risk of significant additional costs, severely impacting business cash flows or reserves. The way that the PAYE system operates is on a weekly basis with the submission of an RTI return and the payment to the worker. This triggers a PAYE liability, although this is not due until the 22nd of the month following. Understanding this cycle is a key aspect of being able to determine any potential liabilities under the new joint and several liability rules. We'll work through an example and use workers who are paid weekly with the reported PAYE liabilities on each week running at £20,000. We can see on this slide that it confirms an RTI has been submitted. The PAYE is not yet due, but there is a reported PAYE of £20,000 for that pay run. You can also see that this means there's a potential joint and several liability of £20,000, although this is not triggered, as the PAYE is not due until the 22nd of the month following. We now look at the second pay run on the second week, and once again we can see the same situation where the RTI has been submitted. PAYE is not yet due, but there are reported PAYE liabilities of £20,000. As a result of this, the potential joint and several liability has now increased to £40,000. Now if we run this through for the whole month, you can see that each week, because of the reported earnings and submission of the RTIs, there's a PAYE liability of £20,000 each week, which means over the course of the month there's now a rolling liability of £80,000. You'll also see in week 5 we've assumed no RTI has been submitted, as week 5 is broken into two parts. This is because the monthly cycle ends on the 5th of the month, and so you can see in week 5 there is only the 4th and 5th of May that would count. We have assumed that this weekly payment will be made in part 2 of that week on or after the 6th of May. Now month 1 is complete. We can see that there's been reported PAYE and NIC liabilities of £80,000, resulting in a potential joint and several liability risk of £80,000, although this hasn't been triggered because the PAYE is not yet due. Now we're going into the second of the monthly cycles, and we're going to look at week 5 part 2, which is the first week of the second monthly cycle. Once again we've reported PAYE liabilities of £20,000, and so your potential joint and several liability risk has now increased to £100,000. In this slide, we roll the payments through until week 7, which is between the 18th and 24th of May. You can see that your potential joint and several liability risk has moved up to £140,000 as you've effectively run 7 payrolls, each carrying £20,000 of liability. Week 7 is an important week, as the PAYE that's been reported in month 1 is now due on the 22nd. Here we're confirming that the month 1 PAYE liabilities of £80,000 are now due. Where PAYE is settled with HMRC, there's generally a delay of between the payment being made and when this can be viewed and confirmed as paid on the HMRC portal for that provider. Typically this can be anywhere between 7 to 10 days, but it can be longer. So where you're relying on a monthly RTI verification of payment, this is unlikely to be carried out until week 8, in some cases even later, if the payment is not updated on the portal and therefore unable to be verified. If we assume for this example that it is updated and the portal can be viewed, as you've run a further pay run, your potential joint and several liability has moved up to £160,000 at this point. When viewing the portal, there are only two outcomes. One is the PAYE NIC is verified on the portal as being paid, or there's no payment shown. It's critically important to understand any leeway that a verification system uses where there is a delay in updating the provider's portal to confirm the payment has actually been received by HMRC. How much time is allowed for this update? And remember, each week is increasing your joint and several liability by £20,000. Once verification has been carried out, if the payment is verified as paid and showing on the portal as paid, your potential joint and several liability drops to £80,000. Month 1 liability has been settled in full, but the month 2 cycle is not due for payment until the 22nd of the following month. Therefore, your rolling liability has reduced to £80,000. If the payment cannot be verified and therefore assumed to have not been paid, this overdue amount can trigger a joint and several liability. We're assuming with this example that if month 1's liability is not paid, then there's a high likelihood that any additional liabilities in month 2, even though they're not due, would also be unlikely to be paid, and therefore at this point you're likely to be facing a joint and several liability in the region of £160,000. In this slide, we're assuming that the PAYE payment for month 1 was verified, and so after the final pay run of month 2, you're now holding a potential joint and several liability of £100,000. You'll see this is higher amount than in month 1, and this is a result of some months having 5 payroll cycles and other months that will have only 4. This means that you could have a potential maximum exposure, assuming prompt updates of HMRC portals, of £180,000. And as we've highlighted earlier, any delay in the HMRC portal being updated to reflect the payment results ends up with your potential liabilities increasing by £20,000 for each week this remains unverified. So, in summary, what we can see is that where all the monies are sent to the umbrella company and you're relying on the umbrella company settling the PAYE liability and verifying this through payslip checks and a monthly RTI verification, there is always going to be a rolling liability as a result of how the PAYE system works, specifically relating to the time differences between when a liability is created and when that liability falls due for payment. The size of the liability is entirely determined by the timing of any event that triggers a failure of an umbrella company. So your maximum exposure is in theory the day before PAYE is due, although where you're using the monthly RTI verifications, your monthly maximum exposure will be the day before the PAYE is verified as being paid, which could be a week or longer after the payment was due. Your minimum exposure will always be the day after you're able to verify that PAYE has been paid for the previous period. In all cases, you're only able to verify and confirm this after the event. At this point, you have no control and face whatever liability is due. Obviously, as you paid all of the money to the umbrella, which included amounts to cover the PAYE liabilities, any additional joint and several liability is an additional cost and effectively will require you paying an amount of PAYE twice. It's also important to understand that when you pay the money to the umbrella, it's in a large fund of money and would be near impossible to verify whose money was paid to cover what liability. And therefore, at the point a joint and several liability is triggered, it would be applied proportionally across all of the companies with reported and unpaid PAYE liabilities, effectively meaning that any event by any one of the umbrella's clients that results in the umbrella failure could trigger a liability on yourselves. Thank you for taking time to watch the video. You'll find other knowledge-based videos explaining other aspects as a result of the changing legislation, so feel free to browse the site. You can reach out to us using the email address on screen, and we're more than happy to organise individual consultations to explain fully how the Fortis system can remove the risk of joint and several liability and put you entirely in control of your supply chain compliance. Thank you very much.